OneDrive is a widely used cloud storage service from Microsoft that allows you to store, share, and sync your files across multiple devices. In this OneDrive API crash course, I'll guide you to getting started with the OneDrive API in Python to streamline your file management and enhance your workflow. OneDrive API is part of Microsoft Graph API service, which is an endpoint connecting to different Microsoft 365 services like Excel, Power BI, Outlook. Throughout the lesson, I'll refer OneDrive API as Microsoft Graph API. This is a beginner-friendly tutorial. To follow along, it is highly recommended that you have some experience working with Python and have an Azure account. The course is structured into 3 parts. In part 1, I'll walk you through the process of creating an Azure app, which is essential for accessing the Microsoft Graph API. Part 2 will focus on setting up the Python environment by installing the necessary dependencies. I'll also guide you to generating an access token, which is the key to connecting to the API endpoint. Finally, in part 3, we'll dive into practical examples. You'll learn how to interact with the OneDrive API by uploading files, listing files, downloading files, and deleting files. By the end of this tutorial, you should have a solid foundation for working with Microsoft Graph API in your project. Now, there are a lot of things that we need to cover. Let's get started. Open a browser and navigate to portal.azure.com. Before we can start using Microsoft Graph API, we need to create an Azure app. An Azure app is a registered application within the Azure Active Directory that provides authentication and authorization to access Microsoft Graph API endpoint. On the top, navigate to App Registrations. Click New Registration. Give the app a name. For the account type, choose the account type that fits your scenario. Here I'm choosing accounts in any organizational directory and personal Microsoft accounts to allow me to use both my work account and personal account. In the redirect URI, choose Web as Platform. For the URI, I'm going to set it to localhost with port number 8000. Click Register to create the app. To connect Microsoft Graph API, we need to store the application ID and the client secret somewhere. I'm going to switch gear a little bit by installing the Python dependencies first. On your terminal, run the command pip install msal httpx python-env to install the Python packages. The MSL Python package is the Microsoft authentication library to generate tokens in order to call different APIs. HTTPX and Python-env are 2 Python packages to make API calls and load environment variables stored in an environment variable file. Once the Python libraries are installed, create a .env file to store environment variables. In the env file, create 2 variables called application ID and client secret. Copy the application ID from Address App Overview page to the application ID. To generate a client secret, click Certificates and Secrets. Click New Client Secret. Click Add to generate a client secret. Copy the secret value to the client secret variable. Save the file and close. Now we're done setting up the Address app. Now let me show you how we can generate an access token in Python. For reusability, create a Python file called msgraph.py. This will be our utility module containing helper functions to simplify various API calls. Import the Python libraries showing on the screen. There are 2 approaches to connect to Microsoft Graph API endpoint, client-side and server-side. The difference is client-side approach doesn't require client secret. Rather, it relies on OAuth2 protocol. Comparing to server-side approach, which requires client secret to connect to Microsoft Graph API, which is more secure overall by not exposing access token. I'll be using the server-side approach to connect to Microsoft Graph API endpoints in this tutorial. Create a function called getAccessToken with three parameters: application ID, client secret, and scopes. Scopes are the level permissions you are granting to the Azure app. You can define the scope manually in the Azure App Console or programmatically in the script, which is the approach I'm showing. And to generate the access token to connect to Microsoft Graph API, it is a two-step process. First, we need to acquire the authorization code. We then take the authorization code to generate an access token. In the function, create a confidential client application instance called client using MSL module. The instance serves the bridge between Python and Azure's app. To create the confidential client application instance, we need to provide application ID, also known as client ID, client secret, and the authority URL to identify the type of request we're making. To acquire the authorization code, call the client.getAuthorizationRequestURL function to get the authorization URL and pass the scopes as an argument to define the permissions. Then open the URL in a web page. Once we acquire the authorization code, we're going to pass it to the authorization code variable via an input prompt. Next, we can generate the access token by using the client.acquireToken by authorization code function and pass the authorization code and scopes. In case if access token is not generated, insert an if statement to check if access token key is present. If so, return the access token from the token response. Otherwise, raise an exception with the reason. To test the helper function, create a main function. Inside the main function, load the application ID and client secret from the environment variable file. Then define the permission scopes. OneDrive API is under the file permission set. The file read, write, or permission will give me both file read and write access. And user read is a required permission to access user's profile, which is generally required to interact with a user's account. You can find the entire permission list from the link in the description below. Call the getAccessToken function and print the headers to be used as authentication. To test if everything is set up correctly, call the main function. If you are running the script for the first time, you'll be prompted to grant API permission to the app, similar to OAuth 2 protocol. In the URL, you should see an authorization code is generated. Pass the code to the input prompt. If we set up everything correctly, from the output, we should see the access token in the headers. And that's everything for getting the access token. Now let's dive into OneDrive examples. Alright, so I prepared 10 practical examples that I think will cover 90% of the use cases. We'll start by learning how to use OneDrive API to list items in a folder. Then we'll gradually dive into file management. To connect to Microsoft Graph API endpoint, in the MS Graph module, I'm going to create a constant called MS Graph base URL and assign the base endpoint for the Microsoft Graph API. Now let's dive into exercise 1, which is to list items in a given folder. When it comes to using OneDrive API for file management, it is all about connecting to different OneDrive API endpoints and use the correct API code method and resource type. In OneDrive, there are two different types of resource type, drive and drive item. You can think drive resource as the drive itself, kind of like a C drive on your PC. And drive items are the physical folders and files inside a Drive resource. There are a lot more things you can do than the 10 examples that I'm showing in this video. I'll put a OneDrive reference link in the description below in case if you want to learn more. To save me some typing, I'm going to define a boilerplate code. Basically, the key thing here is to create the header. And because this is a crash course, I'll be going through each example pretty quickly. To list items in a folder, I'm going to create two functions. The list root folder function is used to list all the items in the root folder, which is the starting point, also known as the top level directory in your OneDrive account. The list folder children function, on the other hand, will take a folder ID and return the items in that folder. The code base for the two functions are pretty similar, except the endpoint URL and the list folder children function has an extra parameter called folder ID. And to retrieve the items, we'll make an API call to the endpoint URL. If the API call is successful, the response will return a list of drive item objects. To use the list root folder function, in the main function, call the function and provide the headers as argument. From the output, we can iterate each drive item object and return the metadata. To distinguish if a drive item is a folder or a file, we can check if folder or file key exists in the object. And to retrieve items from a specific folder, create a folder ID variable and copy the folder ID in the URL. Then call the list folder children function and provide the target folder ID. Save the file and run the script. From the output, you should see the metadata from each item in the OneDrive folder. In this exercise, we're going to learn how to create a folder in OneDrive. Create a function called createFolder with parameters, headers, folder name, and parent folder ID, with default values set to none. In the function, define the URL endpoint first. Then insert an if statement to check if parent folder ID is provided. If parent folder ID is provided, that means we are creating a subfolder in a specific folder. In that case, we need to use a different URL endpoint. In the payload, define the folder name and set the folder value as an empty dictionary. Now in case, if folder name already exists, we can use the Microsoft Graph complex behavior property to define how we want to address the scenario. In this case, I'm going to return an error message if file name already exists. To create the folder, make a post request. If response returns with status code 201, that means the API call is successful, and return as a drive item object. To demonstrate the function usage, in the main function, I'll insert a code block to create a folder called test folder in the root folder and print the metadata of the folder. Under the test folder, I'll create a subfolder called test subfolder. Insert the main function and run the script. Refresh the page and you should see the test folder is created. If I click into the test folder, I should see the subfolder created as well. And to demonstrate how complex behavior works, if I run the script, I'll get an error message. An item with the same name already exists. Here we can update the behavior from fail to rename and rerun the script. Instead of returning as an error, the API code will automatically create a separate folder to avoid overwriting the existing folder. In this exercise, we're going to learn how to upload a file using OneDrive API. Create a function called upload file with parameters, headers, file path, folder ID, and if exists. In the function, define the URL endpoint. Similar to create folder function, insert if statement to check if folder ID is provided. If not, then upload the file to the root folder. To manage if file already exists, if exists argument is set to rename, we will define the complex behavior property to rename. Otherwise, set the parameter as an empty dictionary to replace the file. Then make a put request and attach the file's binary. If the API code is successful, return as a drive item object. To test the function, in the main function, I'll iterate the files in my assets folder. And for the folder destination, I'll upload the files to the test folder I created earlier. Save the file and run the script. Refresh the page, and I should see that the files in my assets folder is now uploaded to OneDrive. In this exercise, we're going to learn how to copy a file using OneDrive API. Create a function called copy file with parameters, headers, file ID, and target folder ID. In the function, define the URL endpoint and payload. In the payload, use the parent reference property and assign the folder ID to the ID key we want to copy the file to. Then make a post request. If the API call is successful, print a message file copied successfully, or you can return as a drive item object. To test the function, in the main function, create two variables to assign the file ID and the folder ID, then call the copy file function. In this case, I want to make a copy of the log file to the test subfolder folder. Save the file and run the script. If I refresh the test subfolder page, I should see the file is copied over. If I want to move a file, very similar to the copy file function, create a function called move file with the same parameters as the copy file function. The code base is almost identical, except we're making a patch request instead of a post request. In the main function, create the file ID and folder ID variables. Then call the move file function. In this case, I want to move the log file to the subfolder. Save the file and run the script. Refresh the page and you should see the log file is now moved to the subfolder. In this exercise, we're going to learn how to rename a file using OneDrive API. Create a function called rename item with parameters, headers, file ID, and new name. The function can be used with both files and folders. In the function, define the URL endpoint and payload. In the payload, use the name key to specify a new file name. Then make a patch request. If the API call is successful, print a message, file renamed successfully. In the main function, create the file ID and new name variables. In this case, I want to rename the log file to log archive. Then call the rename item function. Save the file and run the script. After I refresh the page, I should see the log file is now renamed. In this exercise, we're going to learn how to download a file using OneDrive API. This is probably one of the most important examples since it covers majority of the use cases. To download a file using OneDrive API, it is a two-step process. First, we need to send an API code to retrieve the file location address on the OneDrive server. Then we need to make a separate request code to download the file. Create a function called download file with parameters, headers, file ID, and file name. In the function, define the URL endpoint and make a GET request. If the API code is successful, we'll get a 302 found response redirecting to a pre-authenticated download URL for the file from the location header. Then use the download URL and make a separate GET request to download the file's binary and save the file. To test the function, I want to save all the files in the test folder to my downloaded directory on my PC. Save the file and run the script. If everything is executed successfully, the files will get downloaded in the target folder. In this exercise, we're going to learn how to generate a file share link and download file link programmatically. In OneDrive, a share link is a link that allows you to share access to a file with either read or edit permissions. Download link, on the other hand, is a link that triggers the file download action to save a file. Create two functions called generate share link and generate download link with parameters, headers, and file ID. In the generate share link function, define the URL endpoint and payload. In the payload, use the type key to specify the file write access, and use the scope key to specify who can view the file. If you set the scope to anonymous, it means anyone with the link will have access without needing to sign in. User scope will require anyone who views the file needs to have a Microsoft account. And the organization scope will allow people within the same organization to be able to view the file. You can also set the expression and password. Those two properties are optional. Then make a post request to generate the share link. The generate download link function is not as flexible as the generate share link function. Define the endpoint URL and make a GET request with follow redirectories set to true. If the API code is successful, from the response, you can print the download link from the URL property. To test the functions, in the main function, I'm going to call the generate share link function first, providing the file ID, then print the file share link. Save the file and run the script. And the file share link is generated programmatically. Click the link and it will open the file page in OneDrive. And the generate download link function will work the same way, except it will generate a file download link. In this exercise, we're going to learn how to search files using OneDrive API query method. When it comes to file search, OneDrive API will search across file name, metadata, and file content. Just keep that in mind. To search file in OneDrive, create a function called search file with parameters, headers, and query. In the function, define the URL endpoint with the query parameter appended. Then make a GET request. If the API code is successful, it will return a list of drive items that match the query. To test the function, in the main function, I'll create a variable to define the query, then pass the query to the search file function and iterate the results. Save the file and run the script to print the results. In this exercise, we're going to learn how to delete files and folders using OneDrive API. This is going to be the last example I'll be showing And if you follow along some of the examples, you should have a good foundation by now on how OneDrive API works. To delete files in OneDrive, create a function called delete file with parameters, headers, and file ID. You can use this function to delete a folder as well. In the function, define the URL endpoint. To delete a file, we need to make a delete request call. If response returns with status code 204, it means the drive item is deleted successfully. To test the function, in the main function, I'm going to iterate items in the test folder. If item is a file, then assign the file ID to the file ID variable and call the delete file function with the file ID. Save the file and run the script. If I refresh the page, all the files are now deleted. To delete a folder, you simply call the delete function and pass the folder ID. And this concludes this OneDrive API in Python crash course. And I hope you find this video useful. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more tutorials like this. See you in the next one.